Fellow countrymen, to win this war, Congress pledged the resources of the United States to the last man and the last dollar.
And the nation did use as many men as possible through conscription. Conscription and demobilization show two faces of American warfare, an aggressive side of conscription and the isolationist side of demobilization. So to what extent did the United States fight a total war in World War I? Prior to the United States entering the war, there were only 135,000 men in the military. General John Pershing, the commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, requested for millions of more men. A draft was crucial, and President Woodrow Wilson chose to implement a draft. After much debate, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Selective Service Act into law on May 18, 1917. It allowed the president to increase the regular army, use the National Guard and National Guard Reserve for federal service, and to bring up the military through a nationwide draft. The drafting process was relatively simple. Local draft boards would register men into the draft, give them a lottery number, and examine men for exempts. Men between the ages of 21 and 31 were required to register, which later changed to men between the ages of 18 and 45. By June 5, 1917, 9.5 million men were registered for the draft. On the first draft lottery day, 1,374,000 men were called to duty. The public reaction to the draft was mixed. There were more than 300,000 men that refused to register or did not show up when called to duty. On the other hand, supporters of the draft were passionate about the war effort. The government's propaganda, such as recruitment posters, helped to fuel the support and aided in the success of the draft. About 4,000 men were exempted from military service on the basis of religious or political beliefs, who became known as consensus objectors. Nevertheless, President Wilson implemented areas of non-combatant service in which consensus objectors were required to attend or suffer punishment. Conscription turned out to be a major success during World War I. Nearly 70% of the military was made up of draftees. By the end of the war, a total of 24 million men had registered for the draft and 2.8 million men were called to duty.
Immediately following the end of World War I, the United States began its plan of withdrawing all of its troops from Europe. The act of removing troops at the end of the war is called demobilization. The United States' plan for demobilization was to release 200,000 men initially, and in the following weeks 30,000 soldiers a day. A good number of the soldiers were released from service because the United States wanted to remain isolated from foreign affairs. The U.S. also did not have use for such a large army. Naturally, there were problems that arose due to the fact that the U.S. Army was so large. One of the problems was how they were going to get all the U.S. troops back home because the United States didn't have enough boats. Another problem that occurred because of the massive demobilization was the number of men that were re-entering society and were without jobs. There were also thousands of horses, trucks, motorcycles, trains, weapons, tanks, and planes that the Army had brought over. The problem was what to do with it all. Most of it was left in France to rust and die. Some of it was sold in salvage auctions. Although the demobilization caused many economic problems, it also caused many problems with the troops themselves. When the soldiers were relieved of their duty, they didn't know what else to do because they had been fighting for so long. For example, many pilots had gotten so used to flying that they couldn't stop, so they kept piloting aircraft and became what were known as barnstormers. These barnstormers performed many aerobatics while flying airplanes. This is just one example of how some of them troops couldn't return to a civilian lifestyle because war had changed them. A more serious problem was that some of the men received nightmares. Many of the former soldiers would relive the war experiences while they slept and would have terrible dreams.
Although the United States were not militarily involved for the war's entire duration, when they did enter the war, they did not hesitate to organize a draft that increased the military manpower from 135,000 to over 2.8 million. Even consensus objectors were required to contribute, and the draft's age window was increased during the war. The United States draft, therefore, was a dramatic pursuit to win the war that supports the argument that the United States fought a total war during World War I. On the other hand, the fact that the United States demobilized after the war tends to reveal their less ambitious and isolationist values that supports the argument that the United States did not fight a total war in World War I. Ultimately, World War I would be a precursor to World War II, in which the United States will implement a draft once again and become much more heavily involved and influential on the international stage.